Hi there. So it's Dr. Ryan, and today we're going to talk a little bit about cannabis and its effects on male fertility. This is a topic that comes up a lot in my clinic. Some of my patients are recreational users of marijuana. Some of them are use it for medicinal purposes, and it's a question that comes up a lot among individuals in terms of whether or not it will impact their fertility, their sperm production long term. And so, to answer this question, I prepared a really short presentation that was based really off a great article. And so, let me go ahead and share my screen here. Okay. So, this was just kind of a review of this great review article, Cannabis and Male Fertility, which is just a review article of many different articles in regards to certain aspects of male fertility and cannabis, right? So, let's go to our And the other thing I want to point out is I would highly recommend anyone that's more interested in the article to look through it. It's freely available on PubMed. You can just click on the PMC full free text and see it there. And I'll leave a link to the article in the description of the YouTube video. All right, so let's go talk about this. So can marijuana decrease your sperm count? Okay, so as I mentioned, this article is from the Journal of Urology, and it was published in 2019. And again, it was a review article that looked at many different articles comparing cannabis and certain aspects of fertility over a wide range, wide time period. And just some background, of course, marijuana is a drug derived from the hemp plant Cannabis sativa, Cannabis indica. Its main psychoactive component is THC. It's used for multiple disorders in medicine, dementia, multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's disease, chronic pain. It's much more prevalent. That is, the usage is much more prevalent owing to the legalization within the U.S. and several different states. Eight states have legalized it for recreational use, whereas 19 states have legalized it for medicinal purposes. And just in terms of its physiology, so it binds to CV1 and CV2 G protein coupled cannabinoid receptors, which are scattered throughout the body. But of note, we definitely know that cannabinoid receptors are found on sperm cells. And so just an overview of the article itself. Again, they looked at many different articles starting from the inception of PubMed Medline, which is sometime in the 70s, to May of 2018. They used MESH terms, that stands for medical subject heading terms. It's a way of indexing articles to better organize them. And they look for things like cannabinoid receptors, sperm motility, sperm energy, sperm viability, etc. And they looked at multiple animal and human studies. Now, in this presentation, I really just focused on the human studies with the exception of marijuana's effects on testicular size, which we had to look at animal studies. And they looked at 48 total studies when they made the paper. So just a summary of some of the findings there. They looked at cannabis's effects on sperm parameters, right? Okay, so sperm count and concentration. So cannabis use is strongly associated with reductions in sperm count and concentration in several different human studies. And so two studies they cited, and one in which they looked at 20 chronic marijuana users who smoked marijuana. They found that those who smoked 10 or more times per week had a significantly lower average sperm count than those who smoked 5 to 9 marijuana cigarettes per week. And then there's this very large study involving almost 1,000 participants, and they revealed a pretty similar change. Men who reportedly used marijuana more than once a week had a 28% lower sperm concentration and 29% lower sperm count than men who had never used marijuana. So that's pretty interesting. In terms of morphologies, that's the size and shape of sperm. There's a study that looked at 1,700 patients in the UK presenting at fertility clinics, and the men who had used cannabis in the 3 months prior to collection of a semen sample and were younger than 30 years were twice as likely to be in the category of normal sperm morphology. So in other words, this is a category where less than 4% of your sperm have normal morphology. So 96% of your sperm are abnormal. And the individuals who used cannabis, it said just in 3 months, were much more likely, of course, to be in this category. One good thing though is it appears that cannabis doesn't does induce morphological changes, but it does seem to preserve genetic material. However, at the very end of this presentation, there is something, that a little slide I put up that indicates that there may be a correlation between certain genetic defects. So I wonder if this might put this statement in question. So motility and energy metabolism. So it certainly can lead to alterations in sperm motility. Sperm motility is just basically the ability of the sperm to travel in a straight line towards, of course, the egg within the uterus. And so grade A has the best motility. They tend to move and flagellate into a straight line towards the egg. Grade B are more non-progressive and curved or crooked motion, and grade C they're either immotile or just move their tail and aren't really functional in terms of their motility. And so there were a couple of studies that looked at sperm motility from 16 healthy chronic marijuana users after 4 weeks of high dose marijuana, and there was a significant decrease in their motility. And a study by Barbonetti et al. Showed that the mechanism was due to, as we mentioned, there are cannabinoid receptors on sperm cells, and when they're activated, when you have agonism of the cannabinoid 1 receptors, there seems to be decreased sperm mitochondrial activity, which in turn would lead to decreased activity and motility, right? Ability to move. And then what about the effects on reproductive hormones? Well, if you watched my video on TRT and fertility, or maintaining fertility on TRT, we kind of talked about FSH and LH. I'd highly recommend that you take a look at that if you haven't. This kind of talks about how marijuana affects those. So follicle stimulating hormone, again, one of the hormones released by the pituitary to act on the testes, primarily for spermatogenesis, for growth of sperm. It appears that it doesn't seem to be affected dramatically. Most studies have observed no effect in acute use, but some effect in chronic users. So depression and FSH was observed really by this one study, Colondi and et al. And he compared plasma hormone levels among 11 men who'd used 5 to 9 marijuana cigarettes per week and 9 who'd used 10 or more. And the group using 10 or more cigarettes per week had significantly lower FSH levels. Okay. And then LH is consistently lowered by cannabis in multiple studies. And so again, in addition, there being cannabinoid receptors on sperm cells, it looks like there's also cannabinoid receptors found within the pituitary. And so that may explain why there's a decrease in luteinizing hormone release with marijuana. What about testosterone? So this is a topic of some controversy. Some studies have noted that there is a difference. Some studies have noted there's no difference. This particular study from Colondi et al. Showed that there was a significant reduction. So between chronic and never marijuana users, they found a study in which within that study, the control group's testosterone levels were 742 nanograms per milliliter approximately, whereas the individuals who were smoking marijuana had levels that were 500 and 309, right? And so that was one study. But there have been other studies which showed that marijuana users didn't really have much change, and chronic marijuana users didn't really see much change in terms of their testosterone levels prior to utilizing marijuana and after. And then there was the large cohort study with 1,215 individuals we had mentioned earlier, showed that the testosterone levels were actually 7% higher in self-reported marijuana smokers than in non-users, right? So that's a little unusual. The last study that was kind of big, and this was done on 1,500, or almost 1,600 American men from a 2011 and 2012 United States National Health and Nutrition Survey, showed that there wasn't a difference observed in serum testosterone levels between ever and never users of marijuana, but it does appear that there was a difference in terms of marijuana users who had recently used marijuana. So those individuals who had used marijuana recently seem to have a drop in their testosterone levels. So recency rather than frequency of use can affect testosterone levels, which, kind of makes sense. Now with testicular changes, again, this is one of the aspects where there isn't a lot of human data, but there's definite data suggesting that cannabis can cause testicular atrophy in animals. And so there have been studies in mice and rats that have shown significant dose-dependent reduction in prostate and seminal vesicle weight. And then they also noted evidence of testicular atrophy after consistent and prolonged exposure to cannabis. And the researchers' thoughts on as to what that was due to was damage to the seminiferous tubules from primarily from oxidative stress. And oxidative stress is really just a complicated way of saying cellular damage to the cell membrane from free radicals. And free radicals are really just molecules with unpaired electrons that tend to arise quite a bit with marijuana smoking and cigarette smoking, alcohol usage. And so, of course, they can cause a lot of cellular damage, and appears this occurs in the testicles pretty commonly. Now, with sexual function, it does appear that marijuana seems to augment short-term libido, but it does seem to worsen your ability to achieve an erection. So you may be interested in having sexual activity, but it might worsen your ability to go ahead and actually engage in sexual activity. And so just a couple of keep studies there. Aversa et al. Showed that 64 men evaluated for erectile dysfunction complaints, 78 of those with organic erectile dysfunction admitted to frequently smoking cannabis, in contrast to only 3% with non-organic ED. So organic ED is erectile dysfunction with a physical cause, with a cause that can be attributed to an issue in terms of the tissue, or an issue in terms of receptors, where non-organic is more erectile dysfunction secondary that doesn't have a structural cause. It's more due to a psychiatric component or psychogenic component. And so there's probably some likely impairment in the vasodilation in individuals, because a lot of the physiology behind erections is due to vasodilation of your corpus cavernosum and particular arterioles and veins. And there appears to be some sort of impaired vasodilation occurs with marijuana smokers versus those that aren't. And again, it does, as I mentioned, whereas short-term libido is augmented, the ability to achieve erection does seem to be diminished. And there was an article in it was a rat study where they actually used a CB1 receptor blocker and were able to induce erection, right? Which kind of indicates that perhaps there's a pretty good link here. And then finally, to end, this study wasn't found within the review article, but I thought it was kind of interesting. It was a recent study that came out that looked at cannabis exposure and the increasing incidence of neural tube defects in Canada. And the researchers here, they noted that there was a large increase in neural tube defects that followed a east to west and north-south gradient, so higher amounts of neural tube defects in the northern provinces versus the southern provinces of Canada, and eastern versus western provinces of Canada. And they correlated that with cannabis consumption, and they found that there was a pretty strong statistical association between cannabis consumption and neural tube defects. And what are neural tube defects? Well, basically, they are defects found within the neural tube, which is a primordial organ. It's the precursor to your brain and spinal cord in the fetus, right? And if it doesn't appropriately fuse during development, you can develop certain defects, which are essentially openings of the brain spinal cord. Things like anencephaly, where you have an open brain and don't have a skull vault here. Encephalio, where you actually have a portion of CSF and the meninges protruding through your skull. In terms of the spinal cord, you can have a meningocele or myelomeningocele, and that's just protrusions of CSF through a open spinal cord, or a defect in the spine. So obviously not a great situation for these unfortunate children. And it seems that smoking marijuana may be linked to that. So hopefully that was a good review on my thoughts on marijuana and testicular function. I will say, I think it's a personal choice. And if it does provide benefit for certain medical conditions, I understand that completely. But I think it's best to be informed and understand that every choice has consequences or ramifications, both good and bad. And this video is just done to kind of maybe um, illustrate some of those. Okay, so hopefully this has been helpful, and I look forward to seeing you guys on our next video.